Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the RedBull podcast, where we're on a journey to find the truth about plant medicines, to get rid of the myths, and to change the narrative. I'm your host, Scott Mason, and with us today is Dr. Molly Maloof. Molly is passionate about extending health span through food, technology, and psychedelics. She provides personalized medicine to world-class entrepreneurs, investors, and executives. She, since 2012, has worked as an advisor or consultant to over 50 companies in the digital health, consumer health, and biotech industries. She has been an educator since medical school and pioneered a course on health span at none other than Stanford University. She's publishing a book in 2023 on biohacking for women with Harper Wave Books. She is the founder of Adamo, a brand dedicated to optimizing human capacity and connection with consumer health products and educational media. It is a pleasure to have such a diverse and accomplished guest on the show. So, Molly, welcome.
Hey Scott, how you doing?
I am ecstatic. Look, you and I had a great pre-show interview, and just your mere presence on this podcast gets me excited and happy. And by the time this show is over, the audience is going to understand exactly why. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what we're going to talk about today with you, which is psychedelics and safety, I want to just briefly go over some of the things that we've talked about already in the show to sort of set the stage for this conversation. We've spoken to scientists like Manesh Gurn and Marcus Glennon about how exactly psychedelics and plant medicines impact the brain, the ways in which they change brain patterns and create new pathways that can heal trauma and open up the mind. We've spoken to incredible journalists like David Cox to understand that these medicines really aren't quackery or the same as bizarre sort of, unproven infomercial style natural remedies. But there's really a place for them today in modern Western medicine. Perhaps most impactfully, we've spoken to a woman named Lois Kofi, who suffered incredible trauma in the form of multiple suicides, death, destruction of her business, and was almost at the brink of no return before she discovered plant medicine as a way to heal her trauma and come back.
Yeah.
Anyone who hasn't had a chance to listen to that episode, take a listen to it, because stories like that about real people are why we're here today. The science is interesting and fascinating, but the real people are who we are all here to serve. Your own career serves as proof of that, Molly. And Lois's story really illustrates the impact of having that. After hearing all of this, and I know I'm at the beginning of my journey here, I am opening my mind up to something that I thought was a little bit different when I first began to explore and hear more and more about psychedelics. But I'm going to keep it real, because I'm always keeping it real. I'm still a little bit scared. We talk about things like shamans. We talk about all of these medicines that seem like they are on the fringe of legalization, at least in the United States and in other parts of the Western world, but not necessarily there yet. We talk about where people may get them, but when I have conversations about this, sometimes people say, oh, I went to Peru and I met some random person there and we were in a hut somewhere and doing this, or I was in some situation where I was in a room with someone and they were guiding me through, and all of that sounds great and compelling, but at the same time, without this really being legal, at least in the United States, safety seems like it's a big issue. And not only that, but even if it moves towards legalization, I can't even begin to conceptualize what safety would look like. And as much as I'm open to having my mind expanded and trauma healed, look, Lord knows I've had enough trauma, I still like having my brain intact. And so part of what I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about are these safety issues. And when we had our pre-taping conversation, you had a lot to say about it. How exactly are these things administered generally right now?
Well, right now, the only legal psychedelic that you can find in a clinical practice is ketamine.
Hmm.
And ketamine is really a double-edged sword because not only is it an incredible tool for helping people with depression and anxiety and PTSD,
Yeah.
pain,
Yeah.
but it's also abused pretty significantly in
Mm.
the underground world and in the
Hmm.
recreational world. There's actually quite a good documentary on Vice right now all about ketamine abuse. And so
Mm.
whenever I talk about these medicines, I'm always going to tell you about the whole picture. I'm not going to tell you that they're perfect. I'm not going to say they're not pros and cons, but clinical ketamine is delivered in a few different formats. And each format actually has a different experience. So I'm going to try to enlighten you on how ketamine's used today. So in clinical practice, most doctors are prescribing it in the clinic and they're using intramuscular or intravenous. And depending on the route of administration will determine the effects. So,
Mm.
and also the dose will determine the effects. So,
Mm-hmm.
basically, the higher the dose and the more direct conduit into your bloodstream, the more intense of the experience you're going to have.
Mm.
When people are going to get anesthetics in like a surgery,
Yeah.
they specifically put people in essentially a like sedated state, like
Right.
almost like an unconscious place, like they can literally put you to sleep. But in the clinical practice, they want to get you into essentially what's known as like an out of body experience and
Mm-hmm.
in like an intravenous experience or an intramuscular. Now, if you take it intranasally or sublingually at home or in a clinic, you'll find that the experience may have a little bit of an out of body vibe, but it's going to
Mm-hmm.
be a lot more gentle. It's going to be a lot smoother. You're going to still be fairly conscious throughout the experience. You may find yourself a little bit wobbly on your feet, but it's not the same as if you were intramuscular or intravenous. Now, some people even prescribe rectal ketamine, believe it or not. And
Really?
yes. And the reason why they do that
Sounds
is it
scary.
avoids it avoids first pass metabolism. So your liver metabolizes ketamine, and then your kidneys and your bladder detoxify it and excrete it.
Mm.
So one of the things that some physicians try to do is try to avoid that first pass metabolism,
Mm-hmm.
especially if somebody has any liver toxicity going on or any liver
Mm.
problems.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not as common. It's really, really less common.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, I'll just state very openly that there are people in the recreational space who put ketamine in their butt. And I know someone who, I don't know him personally, but a friend of a friend died this way. And the reason why he died was he actually passed out. He took too much and he ended up cutting off his own airway accidentally while he was unconscious. So these medicines are very powerful.
Whoa.
They can be transformative, but they can kill you. And ketamine's not going to make you stop breathing, but it certainly can if you end up in a position where your airways cut off. So I just want everyone to know that these are not just these are not just like simple things that you should be screwing around with your friends. You really, really, really want to be getting your education done and preferably doing this medicine under supervision of a physician who can actually properly evaluate you to see if you're even a candidate for the medicine. I also know somebody who died because of an aneurysm, and he basically had hypertension, he had high blood pressure, and he was using ketamine recreationally. So ketamine can kill you if you
God.
have a high blood pressure
Wow.
and you have an aneurysm in your brain and it blows. It's not a perfectly safe medicine. It can cause bladder damage. People have peed blood. So when it's a really good medicine if you're depressed and anxious and you really need some relief. It can be an antidepressant, an anti-anxiety medicine. It can help with chronic pain. A lot of chronic pain is due to emotional pain. And
Yeah.
it's great for trauma, but it doesn't come without consequences. So there are plenty of people who develop ketamine use disorder because they've started getting ketamine treatments in a clinical office. This is why we need to have this conversation because we're really here to talk about harm reduction. And we're
Yeah.
here to talk about what are some of the pros and cons of these medicines. How can they work for us to make us healthier, but
Yeah.
how could they potentially hurt us if we misuse them?
First of all, I want to thank you so much for keeping it real. Because one of the things we at yeah, because that's who you love it. But one of the things we at WebDelic strive to be is a credible source of
Exactly.
information and education. And if we are not laying everything out on the table, including an honest discussion of the risks, then we're not being credible. We're being fundamentally dishonest. And that is not
Right.
what we're about. So thank you for that. It can be very easy to get rah rah in it or about it or get excited about the success stories without understanding okay, and the whole issue of recreational drug use of these particular plant medicines being confused with a more clinical supervised application is one that I don't necessarily think is necessarily clear out there. I
Yeah.
just as a
Yeah.
layperson, right, would sort of conflate the two without even really realizing it. Talk to me
Yeah.
a little bit about some of the other ones to the extent you have, and I know you don't have knowledge about every single medicine
Oh, I'm
out there
pretty
that is.
well versed
Then
in
go for it.
psychedelics. I know a
Talk.
lot more than the average doctor knows about psychedelics. I started studying psychedelics when I was in college. I was literally working in the history and philosophy library at the
Wow.
University of Illinois. I'd never done a psychedelic, and I remember being enthralled by this section that was literally about this thick, and it was like on the shelf in the library, and it was all about psychedelics and the history of psychedelics. And I was like,
Mm,
okay, I have stumbled upon something very special here.
wow.
So I checked out the whole section. And I could because I worked in the library. And so I kind of like broke the rules and I would check things out. And that's why I worked in the library. So I could just like study all these things that I didn't want to, I wanted to be able to study anything I wanted at any time. And I really got a lot out of my education because I read so much on top of on top of what I was learning about in school. But it was this, it was this history of psychedelics that really got me an understanding of, wow, these have been a part of human history for a long time. And yet they're demonized. Why? They've been obviously a huge part of our evolution, and they seem to be, very much looked at the time I mean, this was literally when I was 18. I'm 38. So, many years later, 20 years later, it's a different world. Like now
Right.
psychedelics are commonplace. I was reading at the time a lot about, the 60s and what happened with Timothy Leary. I read his biography, and I was fascinated by his, exit from Harvard into this very consumer counterculture movement he created. But really, if you think about Terence McKenna, basically came up with this stoned ape hypothesis. Now, whether it's true or not, we don't really know. But his belief was that humans co-evolved with psychedelics, and that it's possible that they played a role in the development of our neocortex. Now, again, this has not been proven by anyone. This is a hypothesis. This is a possibility. But when you take psychedelics and you take specifically mushrooms, there is a very mystical experience that you go through. It's an almost total unity consciousness. It's a ego death in some cases if you take a high enough dose. Even if you don't take a high enough dose, you drop into a state of total connection to the reality that is that you are not separate from anyone. We are all connected. We are connected to nature. We are connected to each other. We are connected to ourselves. And that unity experience is really what characterizes mushrooms. And mushrooms is particularly good for end of life anxiety, for people suffering from intractable terminal illnesses. It's been studied in those cases. It also is reliably able to induce a mystical experience, of which people who take it describe it being the top five experiences of their life. So I'm a big, big fan of mushrooms, but again, sourcing really matters. So they're not legal right now, and there's a huge variety of strengths that are out there. So you may get mushrooms from a friend and find it barely does anything. And then you get mushrooms from someone else and you're like, "Oh my God, I literally took a tiny bit and I'm super high." So it's a really unregulated place right now. There are thousands of companies that are probably not thousands, maybe hundreds of companies underground that are selling mushroom products. There's even companies that are directly selling on the internet on Google that you can just buy microdoses. It's crazy to me how much of a wild west it is.
That's kind
But,
of scary
you know,
too.
it's a little bit scary because, look, I lived through the marijuana boom, and I lived in Oakland, and I saw these like dispensaries popping up and
Yeah.
all sorts of growth in the marijuana space, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is a new world." And that was 10 years ago. And so I anticipate the next 10 years to be very similarly. We will see a slow, gradual, recreational, and actually it'll start with medicinal, and it'll be state legislated legalization. But if you are producing these medicines and you cross state lines with money or substance, you can get arrested for interstate commerce. So this happened to a friend of mine who went to jail because he got caught being connected to somebody else in the marijuana industry in New York. So we will see people go to jail for this. We will see people get arrested for this. There's a woman who in Indiana got arrested for growing her own mushrooms for her own depression. And she pled guilty because of a public defender telling her to. She's facing jail time and she has 5 children. So
Gosh,
we are going to see a lot of unfortunate casualties of the drug war. But that's just mushrooms. I mean, mushrooms are being studied by Compass Pathways, a multi-billion-dollar company. They have a patent on the synthesis of synthetic psilocybin, and they are pioneering getting this approved for treatment-resistant depression. So we are seeing all sorts of clinics popping up in other countries that are enabling people to go get legal mushroom therapy. You can watch Goop, an episode of people who work for Gwyneth Paltrow getting psilocybin experiences legally in other countries. So that's really the status of psilocybin. I could go into MDMA next if you really want to hear about that.
I do, but before we move on to that, I did have a question about mushrooms, and that is to what extent, as a matter of self-administration or,
Sure.
right, like buying it from your homie down the street, is there a similar sort of risk that you were talking about with ketamine? Can you poison yourself to death from them? Can you
Yeah.
accidentally buy some bag on a corner somewhere and it
Yeah.
be like laced with some stuff? Like
So
what?
it's yeah, mushrooms are really, really interesting. And the reality is that if there was a study done, I believe in the United Kingdom, and they ranked the top 20 most used illegal drugs by danger to health. And mushrooms was at the very bottom of the list. So, of all the drugs that are dangerous to take, mushrooms is extraordinarily safe. Now, if you have a family history of psychosis, of schizophrenia, of bipolar depression with psychotic features, any form of psychosis, you do not want to go near this medicine. And I have a friend who has a family history of schizophrenia. He took mushrooms and he had a very challenging trip. And he was actually like, Molly, you were right. I should never have touched this. And I tell people this because you can really lose your grounding in reality with these medicines. And I personally was very fortunate to have grown up in a very grounded state of Illinois. Salt of the earth people come from Illinois. My parents were still married. I was loved and cared for as a child. I don't have any major mental illnesses. I do have probably a little bit of ADHD, but I was very grounded in a very firm rooting in reality as a child. If you grew up with a lot of abuse and neglect or trauma or depression and mental illness, and you don't have a strong network of people around you, you don't have a strong sense of grounding in reality, mushrooms will bring you up into a higher state of consciousness. And in that state, you can lose touch with normal existence. And people abuse mushrooms, people overuse them, and they do end up with more problems than they came in with. Now, that being said, I know just as many people who've had transformative, life-changing mental health, like they've literally healed themselves from mental illness with these medicines. But unless you know what you're doing, then you could really hurt yourself, which is why I always tell people you do not have to take 3 grams of mushrooms on your first go. There's no reason for you to take more than a tiny bite of them to get your foot holding in this experience of altered states of consciousness. The biggest problem I see with psychedelics is that people don't know the dose, they don't know the source, they just take something that someone handed them at a party,
Yeah.
and they end up way too high, and they end up in an unsafe environment without proper preparation, without proper mindset, and they end up in a very, very challenging trip. Now, that is all avoidable if you actually work with a therapist or a shaman who's clearly knows what they're doing with these medicines. Now, there are websites like Psychedelic Support. There are websites that have these incredible, directories of clinicians and doctors and therapists who I guarantee you'll be able to find somebody who works with mushrooms. But it is not something that you should just haphazardly go do because you could hurt yourself. And I remember the first time I did mushrooms, and I remember it was such I mean, I actually have never done that much again. Like I think I did an enormous amount, and I've never done that heavy of a trip again on mushrooms. It was in my 20s. I didn't touch mushrooms for 10 years after doing one trip because it was so profound. It was so transformative. I was literally speechless for an entire day the next day. I was like, I got the message. I hung up the phone, got the message. This is amazing. But I was surrounded by safety. I was surrounded by friends and my family that loved me at the time. My sister was with me. If you go into that state of deep, deep consciousness expansion and you're not ready for it, it can really destabilize you. And so that's why I'm just such a fan of reading everything you can about this medicine before you even go near it. Because mushrooms are, you're not likely going to find mushrooms that are like laced with other things. It's just not typical. But there are people who've opened up the fridge of their friends and ate a bunch of chocolate that was in the refrigerator. This has happened to children I've known who went over to their friend's house. The children ate a bunch of chocolate, or the mother ate a bunch of chocolate, or the aunt did, and they ended up in the hospital because they were just totally not prepared for eating, 3 grams of mushrooms on accident.
Yeah.
So this is
Yeah.
why we need to actually regulate these things, and we need to properly test them for how much psilocybin they have, because there's a massive wide variety of strength out there, and as a result, people don't know what they're getting and they don't know how to dose.
So there are three things in what you said that I wanted to get to, one after the other. But I'm going to pull aside two right now. You're talking about, in the case of both ketamine and mushrooms,
Yeah,
clinical applications that are under superstructures that are
yeah,
presumably right supported by a regulatory
sure,
infrastructure that would
yeah,
maximize the safety and would have people involved in them that presumably would have some sort of certification that would be able to measure doses
right,
and clinically advise you as well as walk you through the experience. That's
yeah.
number one, and I will assume, but correct me as we go forward, whether that probably would be the dream scenario for us across all of these medicines. How?
I'm gonna have a little bit of an argument with you.
Please do.
Okay.
Please.
Um, I see, this is my own personal opinion. This is a disclaimer. This is my personal opinion. I'm not recommending people prevent, treat, mitigate disease. So FDA or anyone out there listening, this is not me blanketing statementing that you should all go do what I tell you to do. But I am going to give you my own personal opinion, because my personal opinion is a little bit different than what I would recommend a patient do. So when I'm recommending patients do things, I 100% say, you need to know your source. You need to know where you're going. You need to know who you're doing this stuff with. You definitely need to know the person that you're going to be sitting with if you are going to do this medicine. Obviously, you want to choose your shaman like you would your neurosurgeon. That's not something most people know. Now, that being said, the way that I'm watching society evolve and the way I'm seeing things evolve in this space of psychedelics, there's the medicinal pharmaceutical, which is kind of glorified as the ultimate experience. Now, know one thing: there is not enough doctors that are trained in how to administer psilocybin. There is not enough therapists available. There are literally veterans dying every day from PTSD. There are people killing
Yes.
themselves every day from suicide. And by the time that psilocybin gets approved as medicine, thousands of people will have died from addiction and deaths of despair. So I actually feel a responsibility to people to say, look, the chances of you getting in a clinical trial are slim to none. Only a few hundred people have even gotten to be given psychedelics in a clinical trial. So you're going to have to go outside of America and probably go to Jamaica or go to some of these Costa Rican clinics if you want to, or even Amsterdam or Portugal, if you want to get this medicine in a clinical environment, what I would consider an environment where people are actually checking all the boxes for perfectly prescribed preparation, administration, integration. For the rest of us, there's a lot of people that are just using them recreationally, right? There's like just people who are popping caps and going dancing. I'm not going to say that that's a bad thing that you can't go do that. Just know where you're sourcing it, know what you're taking, know how much you're taking. Ask whoever you gave it to how strong they are. Always start with less. You can always add more. That is recreation. In some cases, at least in my own personal experience, like recreation can be a direct conduit with source energy. And there's the spiritual realm. There are 13 psychedelic churches in Austin. There are lots of psychedelic churches all over the country. There are still people getting arrested for distributing mushrooms through psychedelic churches. So you may be able to get mushrooms through a church. Doesn't mean that that church isn't putting their own livelihood at risk by giving it to you. So there's the spiritual, there's the recreational, there's the medicinal, but then there's what I believe is really going to be a very important part of culture, which is human connection and ritual. So we are designed to be connected beings. We are supposed to be in tribes. We are
Yes.
supposed to be experiencing life in collective groups. One in five, or sorry, so apparently 10% of men and 15% of women, somewhere around that number, don't have any friends. So it's not surprising that we have such a massive problem with people suffering from mental illness, when literally the loneliness signal is like a hunger signal. It's supposed to bring you closer to your tribe. If you don't have a tribe, then you devolve into essentially addictions and mental illness and depression and anxiety, and you're not supposed to live alone. You're not supposed to be isolated. Human isolation is actually a way to induce the distinct stress responses. There are thousands of studies on animal isolation and what it does for health. So first and foremost, I just highly recommend that people look at the other possibility, which is that if we take these medicines in community through a ritualized context, for example, ayahuasca. I got invited to an ayahuasca ceremony this weekend. I'm not going to be able to make it, but ayahuasca ceremonies are particularly useful for people because you are taking the medicine in a group ritualized context with a shaman who is caring for you and watching the dose, and everybody is healing in a group community. I've also been to mushroom MDMA ceremonies, and these ceremonies are basically where you have music, you have a therapist or shaman, and you have a community group where everyone's supporting everyone in their transformation.
So much embedded in that I'm going to have to pick apart
I
part
know,
of it.
there's a lot there.
But thank you for that. Look, it's better that than the opposite. This is a substantive interview, and that's what WebDelics is all
Yeah,
about. So
yeah,
let's just talk clinical. I do want to briefly talk about two issues related to the advisability of clinical availability for people that are looking at it, particularly for medicinal purposes. And
yeah.
clinical trials right now are of limited use. But one thing that makes it a little bit heartbreaking about statements, which I'm not denying your expertise in, like you may need to go to Jamaica or to Amsterdam or somewhere like that. Hey,
Yeah.
not everybody can afford that. The homeboys.
Exactly.
Exactly. My mom worked for a dog food factory. We weren't going to Jamaica. Jamaica, Queens was exotic for us, and so
That's what I'm saying. It's
and
out
so
of it's out of people's it's like not realistic right now. Like we have to talk about reality because the truth is that it's going to take 10 years for it's going to take another until 2024 for MDMA to get approved. Probably 2025 for psilocybin to get approved, maybe longer. And in that period of time, a lot of people are going to die of deaths to despair. And if there is a medicine that can actually like transform your health, for example, yesterday, I met a man who his entire life, have you ever seen an essential tremor? Do you know what an
no,
essential tremor is?
I don't have
It's
no
when
idea
you
what that
it's
is.
when you can't eat because you can't pull food into your mouth because you can't even put yeah, you can't put contacts in your eyes because your hands are shaking like this. This man had dealt with this for his entire life. He did ibogaine in Mexico. He did 5-MeO following it up in Mexico. He had the most terrifying, challenging, painful experience of his life, and he came out of it completely gone. No tremor. Went back to
What?
his doctors. Went back to his doctors. I get chills. I mean, I met this man. He has no tremor. He goes to his doctor. His doctor goes,
Gosh.
I have never seen anything like this before. This has never happened in my clinical practice. This is impossible. And this guy goes, I know. When he was in his trip, and Ibogaine is it actually is a very, very risky medicine. You have to have a port in your arm because if your blood pressure goes too low, you can stop your heart. It can cause arrhythmias. You have to have medical supervision. He had medical supervision. He did Ibogaine. He said he felt himself doing psychic surgery on his brain. He was going into his own consciousness
God.
and
Wow.
changing his own neural
Oh my
structures.
God.
He was reprogramming his stomach. He was literally puking up bile because he was like doing psychic surgery on himself. And he was literally like, this happened to me. This is not made up. I went from having a neurological disorder, almost getting deep brain stimulation, almost getting a major surgery, major brain surgery. And I did it to myself through medicine.
I'm
Like, that is a miracle, okay? And like, I've seen multiple miracles like this in my practice. I have had friends of mine I introduced to psychedelics go from literally suicidal to thriving. And it's my job as a doctor to let people know that when you are responsible and you are safe and you're properly supervised and you're properly prepared and you have the right mindset, the right experience, the right dose, and the right integration, these can change your life.
so that story. Look, it's hard to leave me without anything to say. Okay, you did it.
I mean, I was literally
Congratulations.
freaking out when I met this man. I spoke at Soho House yesterday, and I literally had these people coming up to me afterwards saying, "Look, thank you so much for being so candid about your experiences because this happened to me. And this guy comes and has dinner with us and tells us the story. And I just literally almost cried because I was thinking to myself, I know so many people who've had a tremor, and like how many
Yeah,
people would benefit from just having this life-changing medicine, and yet this clinic is only giving it to 750 people.
that could be any of us. So, okay, so that's the reality with regards to clinical. And although in a dream world, we may
Yeah,
one day be in a place where, even in the United States or other parts of Western Europe or anywhere in the
yeah,
world, there are these regulated clinics where people can go and do this sort of things. But until then, we
yeah,
have then the shamanistic world. And I wanted to
yeah,
pull that aside because you've touched on it a few times. But before we do that, I wanted to
sure,
talk a little bit more about some of the safety issues and thinking that one should have with regards to at least two other types of plant medicines that come up frequently,
sure.
one of which you mentioned earlier,
Yeah,
MDMA, and then ayahuasca. So maybe you
yeah,
could walk us through some of the thinking about that, and then we're going to talk a little bit about shamanistic practices and
sure.
safety, because that's where I start to get a little bit of that
Hey, me
horror
too.
movie feel. All
Me
right.
too.
Thank you so much
I
for that.
mean, 100% am I freaked out about this, the underground world of shamanism. It
Well,
freaks me out.
and just as an aside, I don't know if you or anyone watching or listening to this has ever read the book Bowling Alone, but it is a powerful, massive academic study about the rise of alienation and separation
Yes.
and disconnect in the Western world. You don't need me to tell you this, but the audience may need to. I mean, the amount of data
I
on
gotta
this
read this
is
book.
overwhelming. I'll send you the link after the show is over, but the name of the book is Bowling Alone. It's a classic, and it's disturbing. That being
Yeah.
said, this it also goes as to the need for connection that you're talking about.
Yes.
Tying that back in, part of why I am hearing, and I could be wrong, that you are so passionate about this isn't just these others mind-blowing stories that you've shared, but you've said yourself that some of these experiences you have had have been truly transformative. Talk to us a little bit, to the extent that you can, about how they've transformed you, what you mean by that.
Okay, so again, another disclaimer here
Yes.
because my experience with MDMA is not something I would recommend people repeat because it was at the time fairly irresponsible. I was in my late 20s and I was at Burning Man and I met a guy. We fell in love and we experimented with MDMA for like 2 weeks. And it ended up it being this extraordinary life transformative experience because I went from having three different sexual dysfunctions. I had sexual pain, I had hypoactive arousal, and I had anorgasmia. And I didn't even know I had these conditions until they were eliminated through love and safe sexual experiences under the influence of MDMA. So I basically had this spontaneous sexual healing. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, I've never had an orgasm with a man before. And I've never felt this way physically. I was so safe. What happened to me? And it wasn't, I mean, I told my friends about it and they were like, oh, yeah, you don't want to talk about that. That's crazy. And I was like, yeah, but it was really important to me. It was a really important part of my life. Now, fast forward, MAPS comes along. It's like 2013. And I decided to volunteer at one of their conferences. And I
And
remember I was
MAPS
this
is
the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies.
nice.
So this was before they were even they were even developing MDMA. And they were just throwing these conferences and raising awareness about psychedelics. So I got involved with MAPS then because I was like, I want to be a part of this cool movement, this conference. And then from there, fast forward a few years, and MAPS started developing MDMA as a clinical intervention. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, I wonder why they chose PTSD. And I looked up the definition of PTSD and I go, well, this is weird. I benefited tremendously from MDMA, and yet I didn't have PTSD. So when I was working on an alternative to MDMA last year, I was working on a pharmaceutical before I started working on nutraceuticals. I discovered I did a bunch of research into entactogens and discovered that essentially MDMA and the class of what's known as an entactogen is a medicine that can increase the feelings of empathy within, to touch within. And it also increases the same neurotransmitters as love and connection. So, human love and attachment, this is basically dopamine, which makes things feel significant, novel, pleasurable. And then norepinephrine makes you very interested in something because it's the stress hormone. It makes you move and move towards something
Yeah.
of interest. And then serotonin makes you feel connected, warm and fuzzy, and like you're not alone. And then oxytocin is this really, it's a bonding hormone of safety, trust, and love. So MDMA opens up this early social reward learning pathway that they thought was closed after the first few years of life. This period of life is so important for development because if people get abused as children,
Yeah.
sexually, physically,
Yeah.
emotionally, neglected, it can have lifelong consequences. It can increase the chances of repeat sexual dysfunction, or sorry, repeat sexual abuse, criminality. Adverse childhood experiences can lead to chronic disease, depression, anxiety, addictions, you name it. It's like early life periods are really challenging. Now, I wasn't abused or neglected in early life, but I did have sexual trauma in my 20s. And you just by having a social injury like sexual trauma can literally program your brain to associate that experience with danger. So literally every time I would have sex, I would completely dissociate from my body and I would be basically disconnected as a freeze response. My body was in a state of almost like going through the motions of sexuality but not being present at all because my brain was trying to protect me from further abuse and it was trying to kind of disconnect me from the experience. So a lot of women experience this. Turns out that 30% of women who have sexual trauma develop PTSD, but 60 to 80% of them develop sexual dysfunction. So I accidentally healed my sexual dysfunction with MDMA, with a safe partner in a safe context. That the safety is really key here because if you experiment with MDMA with someone you don't trust, who you don't feel a sense of any real connection to, someone who you don't feel safe with, you can actually create more trauma. So it's really important. I've actually had no women who've had experiences with MDMA therapy underground, and they've met with therapists, and they didn't really know the therapist particularly well. They didn't really trust them, and basically, they ended up feeling anxious the entire time they got the treatment, and they ended up having a maladaptive experience where their trauma was actually worsened. And
So sad.
the reason why this can happen is because your brain is so wired to help you survive that it has a kill switch. And the switch is if I'm in danger, I'm not going to let oxytocin hit the oxytocin receptor because that would basically keep me in an unsafe situation. So I'm going to activate the vasopressin receptor and create a sense of protection and defense. And so you don't want to be doing this medicine in any context where you don't feel safe because you can actually induce a nervous system experience where you feel actually very, very anxious. And that anxiety can actually worsen your trauma. So it's just so important that people understand we're just at the very beginning of understanding how to really properly administer these medicines in a clinical context. And other very important thing you should know about is you don't want to take a love drug with someone you don't want to fall in love with. So very importantly, one of the reasons why they have two therapists sit with you during an MDMA experience is because MDMA can make you develop feelings for people that you're not supposed to be in love with. So it's
Wow.
really, really important. And actually, they're getting better outcomes in people with PTSD when they do conjoint therapy where you take the medicine with your loved one. So when you take the
Wow.
medicine with your partner versus you take the medicine alone, you're going to have better outcomes when you take it with someone that you trust.
Really interesting. The biggest psychological challenge that I've had in my life has been related to PTSD and associated anxiety. Now,
Yeah.
fortunately, I have someone that I love very much and who I trust. So, getting even more in love would probably be best for both of us. I'd never thought about the concept of doing sort of a joint therapy like that. Really fascinating. Can we talk briefly about safety concerns, if they're any different vis-a-vis
Oh, yeah.
ayahuasca and then,
Yeah.
MDMA?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the safety of MDMA. Now, there are papers written about MDMA that say it's not neurotoxic, but I think the jury's still out. Anytime that you take this medicine and you essentially if you were to get overheated, and that can actually be really challenging on the body, and you can end up dehydrated and get really sick. So this is what happens in raves and club culture. Is kids end up doing a lot of MDMA. They don't drink enough water, and they can get hyperthermia. That can cause brain damage for sure. Now, other thing that you need to know about is MDMA, like at least according to this NIH researcher that I had a phone call with, he does not believe that MDMA is not neurotoxic. It does create some toxic adducts that can get inside the cell and actually cause some damage to serotonergic neurons. So I highly recommend that you take coenzyme Q10, high dose ultra purified pharmaceutical grade omegas. If you can get a prescription from your doctor, they're the best. Lavasa. I also recommend that you take green tea extract and ALA and all of these antioxidants and anti-inflammatories to really mitigate some of the damage done to the brain. And then afterwards, my favorite supplement for restoring the neurotransmitters is SAMe. I don't really take 5-HTP for it. Some people like it, some people don't. It's really hit or miss for people. But you really want to kind of nourish your brain. I love N-acetylcysteine. It's a great tool for detoxification. Just really supporting your body and your mind after you do these psychedelic experiences, specifically when they're chemicals, is really smart. Now, ayahuasca, I have had nothing but positive experiences with ayahuasca, but keep in mind, I have done a lot of work on my trauma before I even touched it. Now, my
Hmm.
experience with ayahuasca is if you don't trust your shaman, you're not going to drop in. You really got to trust your shaman really deeply. Like the first few times I did ayahuasca, I did not really trust the shaman, and I just sat there kind of holding space, did not connect with the mother ayahuasca at all. And then like the third and fourth time I did it, it was like pure bliss for me. But again, I've done a lot of work on my trauma. If you haven't, you may find yourself literally on the floor in a bathroom. I know a woman who actually she did shit her pants and vomit all over the bathroom. Like you can lose all bowel control. You can
God.
lose you will be puking up all sorts of stuff. I personally don't get that nauseous when I do it, but it really is a very clear kind of predictor of A, how comfortable are you with these life transformative experiences, and B, like you may have a lot of stuff under the surface that you have not even looked at, and it will show you what you need to see. So I would recommend really purifying your body ahead of time, doing the dieta, just properly
Hmm.
doing some work with a therapist. And
Hmm.
honestly, the best thing you can do with any of these medicines is get an integration therapist. Get a psychotherapist who's comfortable with psychedelics, who will sit with you and help you work through the process of integration, because that is literally where all the work lies. It is not in these peak experiences. It is in all that you do in between these peak experiences that actually leads to real lasting behavioral change, which is what actually leads to lasting life change.
Shamans. Who are these people? How do I even know if they're any good? I could call myself a shaman and people might believe me. How do I know it ain't just Scott Mason saying he's a shaman and trusting me with anything? Especially because I hear about people, and this could be rumors, but you hear about people going to places like, well, I won't name any countries because I don't want those countries to hate me, but certain locations around the world, and there are like these Mick shamans basically that come up.
Yeah.
And so that's
Yeah.
terrifying. What can you tell us about being safe and not
Yeah.
making a mistake and ending up with some random person who doesn't
So,
care about you,
the
just cares
first
about a
thing I would
buck?
tell you, yeah, the first thing I would tell you is first and foremost, your shaman should not be engaging in sexual activity with you or anyone else that they are working with in a clinical context. Same thing goes with your doctor. Same thing goes with your therapist. There should never be, I mean, it goes without saying, but I actually
Yeah,
have to say it.
I'm shocked to hear that that happens, but okay, I
No,
think
it
that
is absolutely in every industry, whether people do psychedelics or not. It happens. And the problem is with psychedelics is that you're extraordinarily vulnerable and there's a power differential. So not only are you vulnerable with a power differential, but that puts you in a position where you could be taken advantage of. And the last thing I want anyone to do is actually get re-traumatized. So there are experiences of people who have been led to the Amazon by a shaman they met at Burning Man and ended up getting raped and basically like
oh my
psychically and
God,
physically raped. And it is really, really, really rare. But when it does happen, it makes headlines.
it's
There was
so
an entire
horrible.
podcast series on this woman who had an extraordinarily horrible experience. And, she was drugged with scopolamine, which is a very, very, very dangerous medicine that comes from this plant that datura, which you should never, ever, ever be exposed to. So I really just want people to know that, like, A, if you can find a shaman on American soil, that's great. But again, they're really doing that. Like ideally, you want to find someone who's trained in Peru, trained in the Amazon, done the work with the elders of different indigenous cultures, and really truly brought that knowledge and that wisdom back with them. There's a lot of haphazard living room shamans who
Yeah.
don't actually have any real connection to the lineage that they have claimed to get their expertise from. So that shamans are really shamans, physicians, priests, magicians, we all come from the same cloth, right? Now, the real difference between a Western physician and a shaman is we have gone through medical school and have been trained in a very clear philosophy of thinking. Now, that isn't to say that you can't get a great experience from a really good shaman. One of my friends who I met in the Bay Area, she did just as much education as I did in medical school with shamanism, and she's considered to be one of the best shamans in America. Now, that is the kind of person you want to turn to, somebody who's got social credit, somebody who people really trust, somebody who people really believe is going to guide them in the right direction. There are people in my community here in Austin that are losing credibility because they're just not engaging in activities and behaviors that are really respectful.
There is a lot I'm taking away from this. First of all, understand that these are powerful medicines and that they all have potential consequences if they are administered or approached in a way that is haphazard or not respectful of their power.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, that the experience is one that needs to be prepared for and not just
Yes.
lightly stepped into. And then number three, investigating anything that you're doing thoroughly to make sure that it ain't just it isn't going to damage you. If there is one last takeaway that you would like to leave our audience with today, Molly, what would it be?
You know, I really just believe whether you use psychedelics or not, the most important thing that you can do for your health is to really work on your relationships with your community and develop these super strong social ties. Through your community, you can engage in social sports, you can engage in eating really healthy foods, you can change your health behaviors more effectively in community. And if you really want to optimize your health and resilience with the world becoming more complex and chaotic, you have to know that investing your time and your money in your community is going to reap the biggest dividends for your longevity. It is the greatest factor that we know in long-term health and happiness is your close personal relationships. So you don't necessarily have to have a giant community like me, but if you really, really invest in your community, it's going to pay massive dividends in your health. Nobody, if we hit World War III, if we end up in a massive like global economic collapse, nothing will matter more than the people in your life. Not the Louis Vuitton bag won't matter. The house you live in, nobody will care. The only thing that will matter is who you know who can help you survive. And so I really just want to emphasize, like, no matter what, your relationships are literally the biggest tie to your longevity and your happiness. And I believe community-based psychedelic experiences are likely going to be, if not some of the most safe experiences you can take, if you know what your dose you're taking and what medicine you're on. So I don't think we have enough time to wait for pharmaceuticals. There are too many people that are killing themselves every day. And part of the reason why is because they're not connected. So we have to get reconnected. If you know someone in your community who really is clearly struggling with drugs or alcohol, what they need is you to sit down with them and say, hey, I can tell that you're hurting. I'm here for you. And if we all did this for each other, we would see a lot less suicide. We'd see a lot less mass murder. You know, a lot of these kids who are committing these horrible, horrific crimes, they were abused and neglected children who couldn't afford to feed themselves properly, who don't have any friends or family around them, and they self-destruct because of isolation and because of social injury. So really, it's up to us as leaders in our community to actually galvanize and to create the conditions for a better world for everyone.
A truly unexpected takeaway. One final question before we close out. How can people find more about you and what you're doing, Molly?
Sure. Follow me on Instagram at drmolly.co. Follow me on Twitter at Molly Maloof MD. Follow me on LinkedIn, Molly Maloof MD, Molly Maloof. And I'm really easy to contact through social media. It's probably the easiest way to find me.
Thank you so much. Molly, it has been great having you on the show today. Thank you so much for sharing your insight, your knowledge, and most importantly, your wisdom. It's been revelatory. Now, for those of you who are listening or watching, keep tuning in. In upcoming episodes, we're going to be discussing the history of psychedelics. We're going to be discussing social concerns related to psychedelics, everything from religion to race and politics. We're also going to be talking about psychedelics and the law, as well as hearing more powerful stories like the one that Molly shared today about people's own transformations through engagement with these plant medicines. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to learn more, be sure to subscribe, leave a review or a comment, and tell the folks that you care about everything that we're doing. Also, don't forget to follow WebDelics on Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And be sure to check out our website at webdelics.com. That's WEBDELICS.com. And sign up to our blog for trusted educational information about plant medicine and psychedelics. Then join us next time for another episode of the WebDelics podcast.